let's talk about potassium. And potassium, I put this up here just because, K, you did K because that's the thing for potassium. Well, anyway, potassium's not actually bad, but too much potassium is bad, and we hear about this often. We do a lot to treat it, and a lot of our like ACLS stuff is built around treating potassium and doing that kind of stuff, and assuming that it's causing your cardiac arrest. So too much potassium can be really bad for you. And I wanted to hit on it because of a couple of recent cases that I had, both involving potassium. What is potassium? It actually looks like this if you put it into metal form. It's really interesting. You can cut it with a knife. It's like cream cheese kind of consistency, but a little bit grainier. But that's what metal potassium looks like. Potassium's cool because it reacts with a whole bunch of stuff. Here's if you throw potassium in water, woo, look at it go. Good little thing. It's very reactive. Burns pretty easily. And that's why I remember distinctly them talking one time about it was on MASH, and they were like these potassium flares that this guy got burned with, and they were like, "Oh, you can't don't put it in water. You have to immerse the guy in mineral oil, and then we have to take it out under there because otherwise the potassium will explode." I don't know why I remember that, but like that's what potassium sticks in my mind as. It's like the thing that apparently is in flares that can terribly burn people if you put it in water. And well, here's what it looks like if you put it on top of water. So you don't have to know too much about this graph except to say that this is your chance of dying if your potassium level is either low or high. And you notice that there's a spot right in the middle, and that's our total body, or that's our serum potassium level, somewhere between like 4 or so. That's where we want to live. But if you have too little potassium, your chance of dying goes up. You have too much potassium, your chance of dying goes up. And interestingly enough, it's almost as much. We think about the high stuff as being the dangerous one. The risk of death is almost as high if your potassium's really low. So just kind of an interesting finding. I know for most of my medical career, I kind of ignored low potassium. Like everybody's got low potassium because most people do because they're on things that make you pee out a lot of potassium. I never really attributed it, but you can. It being low is kind of just as bad as it being high, but maybe not as dramatic a thing. Here's potassium metabolism. Everybody's responsible for this. Of course, I'm making a terrible joke again. You've probably never heard that one before. Let's talk about potassium itself and get off this busy slide and go into the way that Walt's brain works for this. You take in potassium through your mouth. That's how it gets in there, and it's dietary. For the most part, there's very few people that actually have trouble getting enough potassium because it is in literally everything. It's in bread, it's in meat, it's in coffee. Pretty much everything out there. Apricots, as a matter of fact, have a ton of potassium in them. So if you eat a whole bunch of apricots, you're actually getting a high dose of potassium. But you can pretty much eat as many apricots as you want, and not run into problems because we're so good at getting rid of it. So it goes in through your mouth, it's absorbed in your stomach, and from there, stomach and your intestines, more specifically your gut, let's say. From there, it goes out into your blood and into your cells. Now, here's a Walt's diagram of a cell in the middle. What you should probably remember, and this is super, super important for some people, if you're going to be taking like registry tests and stuff, the potassium is most of your body's potassium lives inside the cells itself. It is 90% of the 98% of the potassium that you have in your body is inside the cells themselves, and just a relatively little bit in the blood and in the space surrounding the cells. So almost all of it is in the cells themselves. The level outside is that 4 millimoles per liter, something like that. It all lives mostly in cells themselves, which is interestingly enough, like why when you smash a bunch of cells, your potassium goes way up because now you've liberated all those potassium that was previously kept inside the cells themselves. Where does potassium leave your body? Mostly through your urine, about 90% of it, and you poop out like 10% of it for that goes in. And again, we're pretty efficient at getting rid of it if we need to. It's not impossible to get hyperkalemic based on your diet. If you have healthy functioning kidneys and you're not on medicines. Now, if you don't have functioning kidneys, then you kind of sometimes rapidly lose the ability to get rid of that potassium, and that can be a big deal, especially if it happens, pretty quickly. If you don't have functioning kidneys, or if you're on medicines that change the way your kidneys get rid of it, then you don't get rid of that potassium quite so well, and then all of a sudden the amount of potassium you eat kind of maybe does become a big deal. So one more time, with feeling, most of the potassium in our body lives inside the cells themselves. There is one other really high yield point here that if you are taking an exam, that you just have to remember this thing, because for some reason this is on the registry test all the time, and who knows why, because it doesn't really make any difference to the way that you're going to practice. And I can say that, and I'm a guy that thinks that actually we probably should know all this stuff because it just makes you smarter. The reason I bring this up, the gradient of potassium in your cells and outside your cells is what makes a lot of stuff work in your body. And you have to expend energy to do that. You have to expend your ATP to make that happen, because your body has the sodium potassium ATPase, or sodium potassium pump, which pumps potassium into the cell despite the concentration gradient. Potassium doesn't want to run into your cell; it wants to run out of your cell because of the concentration of potassium in your cell is so high already. It wants to go back out. You have these little enzymatic machines that pump potassium into your cell. So how are you going to remember this for your registry test? The same way that I remembered it for your registry test, which was remember that potassium is high inside the cell, and so you must have some way of actively pumping potassium into it, and that's that sodium potassium pump. Interesting. Again, why does it make a difference? The sodium potassium pump probably doesn't, except to say that most of the potassium stays in your cells. That costs energy, and that is what allows much of our body to work. That potassium gradient is what allows a lot of the electrical signals and a lot of the muscular stuff, and a lot of our neurological stuff. That's what keeps that all functioning. It may not be the potassium itself that's moving, but it's the presence of that potassium there that actually makes a big difference to it. So I won't stress it any more than that, other than to say, again, most of the potassium in our body lives in our cells, and that's what lets our bodies function. Cool. Potassium is pretty important. Here's an example of where it may be more important and is a little bit more pertinent to what we're saying. This is cardiac conduction in the heart, and this may not make a whole lot of sense, but basically this is the electrical signal that goes through our cells. This is the electrical voltage across the cell membrane. What regulates that is, come on there. I don't know where we're pointing right. You can't really see it. Sorry. What regulates it largely is sodium on one side and potassium on the other side. So now things are sort of becoming important. That potassium gradient is important for letting your letting repolarization happen in your heart. So if you look at it, sodium kind of runs in here, here's your baseline down here, sodium runs in here. It's potassium that balances out that sodium and gets you back down towards your baseline. If you have an abnormality in the way that you process potassium, or in how much potassium you have, your cells can't get back down to baseline. This is a cardiac cell, so when they don't function, they don't beat. When your heart doesn't beat, then you don't pump blood. When you don't get blood through your body, your brain dies. That's why potassium is sort of important. And again, I don't want to talk too much more about it. I'll just kind of leave it be. There we go. What does hyperkalemia look like? It looks like everything else. It is the prototypical weak and dizzy and fainting sort of syndrome. So the person feels generally weak because, again, it affects the way that your nerves work and the way that your muscles work. They may faint. They may have what appears to be a whole body paralysis. This may look something like a stroke, although it usually doesn't come on very quickly. But they may have true weakness, like somebody comes in. We've all seen them. They say, "Oh, I can't move my arms or legs." Something like that. If they do actually have true weakness, though, that can be because of potassium. And so that's why we check these things. It can cause paresthesias or tingling because it messes with the way that your nerves conduct. And of course, we've seen, or we've probably heard of, the way that it messes with your heart and causes cardiac arrhythmias, which is the most probably important part, for the most salient thing for what we're going to be doing. The weakness, the paresthesias, that kind of stuff. probably not going to kill you. It's probably not that your diaphragm is going to be so weak that you can't breathe. It's probably going to be much more likely that you experience cardiac arrhythmia with it. So let's talk cardiac stuff real quick. Here is an EKG tracing. The level of potassium influences what your EKG looks like. And it's supposed to go in sort of a thing like this. You start off with, a normal looking EKG at the top. When your potassium's kind of high, the first change you're supposed to see is that your T wave gets really peaked, gets pointed, looks like a mountain. And this isn't just like it's kind of big, but it really looks like a pointy, like kind of a needle. You'll see that a little bit more as we get into it. I'll show you a bunch of examples coming up here. So you get the T wave first, theoretically. The next thing you're supposed to see is that the PR interval gets wide. So there it goes. So your P wave gets smaller and the distance between the P wave and the QRS gets larger. And the whole thing starts to stretch out. Your QRS complex gets, if you compare to that one, gets wider. And it eventually keeps widening out until it becomes a sine wave. So it doesn't really look like the typical QRS complex at all. It just looks like, a sine, up and down, up and down, up and down. Going the wrong direction there, sorry. Those are the prototypical changes for hyperkalemia. And again, we'll get into that in just a second. I'll explain a little bit more. Here is the classic peak T wave. And again, the T waves themselves do look relatively distinct. The T waves themselves are right here. You may have looked at this and initially thought like, maybe this little thing is the T wave because this is the big, that's bigger, so it must be the QRS. No, in this case, the little one is the QRS. The big one, the big spiky thing, is the T wave itself. And you can notice that out here. You see how big and pointed they are. Most of us would look at this, if you've looked at a couple of EKGs before, most of us would look at that and say, man, I don't know exactly what it is, but something's just not ringing right with it. That's often hyperkalemia. When it is, you look at it and you distinctly say, man, something is not right about that. Think hyperkalemia with it. So peak T wave, first thing that you're supposed to see. And folks say that this happens, when you first start to get hyperkalemic, like, a potassium level of 6. If 4 is normal and 5 is the upper limit of normal, then 6 you may get like P waves. What we'll find is that it doesn't actually matter like what the level is. You can get kind of any of these changes almost at any level. But that's what folks say anyway. Once you get the peak T wave, the easiest way to think about the next thing that happens is that if you were to grab both, if the EKG was a string and you were to grab both ends of it and start pulling it apart, that's what the progression is. And the farther you pull, the higher the potassium is. So you start off with something like this, a relatively normal EKG tracing, start pulling on the ends of it. You notice you start pulling the QRS apart and the PR interval gets wide and the bump that is the P wave gets pulled out and flattened out. And that progresses and it gets wider and wider the longer you pull until it develops something more like that. Again, that sine wave pattern where things are just going up and down and up and down and up and down. And then eventually that could go on to just like asystole entirely with no QRS complexes, or it could go to a VF. But that's the typical progression of it is, again, think that you took both ends of the EKG and you just started stretching it out. That's what the changes for hyperkalemia sort of look like. Here's some of those changes. You notice on this one, what are we seeing here? Well, you've got tall T waves, certainly. You've got this wide QRS. You don't see P waves, or if they're there, they're sort of buried in it. And it does have that look of like just going up and down and up and down and up and down. It's certainly approaching it if it doesn't look exactly like that. So this person's potassium level is like 9.3. And again, the upper limit of like what's normal is a 5. So that's pretty high. You get the same kind of thing here. Again, big wide QRS. You don't have that like super tall T wave, but it's pretty broad, nothing else. And it's starting to look like that sine wave, just the up and down without real distinct QRS complexes. Don't see any P waves or anything like that. I can't remember this person's potassium. It was like 8 and change, I think, or something like that. Here it's much more pronounced. This person's potassium is 9.9, which is super high, and often bordering on incompatible with actual living, although it's not just the level, it's the rate at which that level happened that seems to make a difference. But here's same thing. As I said, anything that looks just kind of weird, you should think hyperkalemia, especially if it's slow and especially if it's a wide QRS complex. You can see how this looks just kind of there, and we're going up and down and up and down and up and down and up and down and up and down. It's developed that sine wave look to it. So these are the prototypical classical really bad hyperkalemia stuff. Again, this person's potassium like 9.9. It is important to note, though, that you don't necessarily have to have a potassium of 9 to get that exact same pattern. Some folks some folks that are on dialysis may have a long-standing potassium of 6.5 or 7, especially if they're not compliant with dialysis. And they may not have any EKG changes at all, even though for, in the normal person, the person that's not used to it, potassium of 7 gives you this one with the big peak T waves already, or sometimes it can even lead to a cardiac arrest. But the person who, again, who has this for a while, who can tolerate it, for some reason, we don't know exactly why, but folks that have a chronically elevated potassium seem to tolerate it better, and they don't get the EKG changes. So, again, this guy at the top is 7.3, which doesn't exactly stick in with like the peak T wave of 5.5 to 6.5. These folks all kind of follow it a little bit, but here's a person that was in cardiac arrest with a potassium of 7.1. And again, if it happens really fast, that seems to be the thing that really puts you in a worse state. You do seem to be able to compensate for it at least a little bit. This is another one, potassium 6.2 in brachysystolic arrest. That's surprising because you aren't supposed to see that, at least based on what the textbook tells you. It seems to be the rate of rise of the potassium that really makes a big difference. If you get an injection of potassium, it may only raise your total, your potassium level by 30, or by 2 points, let's say. So you go from 4.0 to 6.0. But if you're not used to it, if that happens quickly, that may kill you, which is why potassium infusions are a little bit dangerous to administer. The take-home point is that any weird-looking EKG or any bradycardic EKG, you should think hyperkalemia. It may not be, but you should think about it, and you should think long and hard if you need to treat them for hyperkalemia. And if they have a weird-looking bradycardic EKG and you notice a dialysis shunt in their arm, that's hyperkalemia almost all the time. And so you should probably treat it. How do you treat these things? There's 3 steps. What we're going to do in the pre-hospital field is mostly stabilize the membrane. We're going to stabilize the cardiac conduction so that they continue to live. That will give us enough time to sort of hide the potassium other places in the body. And then at some point, somebody's going to have to get rid of all that potassium. But the first 2 are what we're really going to do. So how do you stabilize the membrane? The answer is calcium. And I won't go into why calcium really works for it. Just know that when you give calcium, it stabilizes the action potential across the cardiac membrane, and you stop getting that big wide QRS. Calcium works in about a minute. You give usually a gram of calcium chloride or 2 to 3 grams of calcium gluconate, preferably calcium gluconate if you have a peripheral IV. In cardiac arrest, we give the chloride because it's a smaller amount, and you're like, well, they've got bigger fish to fry. You can give the chloride peripherally, but if it extravasates, it's a little bit more dangerous, and it's hard on the vessels. Anyway, let's say that you've got calcium gluconate, and you give 2 to 3 grams of it with abandon. If it is going to work, it usually works in about a minute. If you haven't gotten a response in about 5 minutes, you can redose it. And the effects of it last somewhere between 5 and 30 minutes. It wears off relatively quickly. Calcium is essentially, although we reach for it often, calcium is essentially the bag valve mask of hyperkalemia because it's a good temporizing solution. It works really well. If you have someplace else you can go with it after that. The calcium is not the treatment. The calcium is just the thing that keeps the person from dying in the meantime and allows you to get other stuff done. So here's just an example of calcium working. Here's that sinusoidal pattern. This guy's potassium is, like 9 or some odd, something like that. They give him some calcium gluconate. And you notice that the QRS gets a little narrower, and he's starting to develop what looks like a more normal conduction. They give him another dose of calcium, and this is within 5 minutes. He goes down to a normal, not entirely normal, but a somewhat more normal looking EKG, from impending arrest down to essentially a normal looking EKG. Unfortunately, though, this is from credit to Dr. Smith's EKG blog. Within like 4 minutes after that last dose of calcium, he goes back to this pattern. And that's the unfortunate problem with a lot of these hyperkalemia patients, is that the calcium only works for a short period of time. And so it expands, the QRS widens back out. And, you know, you're basically just, you keep giving them calcium until you run out of calcium. And then the patient usually has been in arrest for a while at that point. But that's fairly typical. The calcium is really important, but what the calcium does is buy you time to do other things with the potassium. The calcium doesn't actually affect the potassium. It just kind of keeps the person from dying in the meantime. What you got to do at that point is find some other place to stow whatever extra potassium is out there away. And usually you do that in a couple of different ways. Again, remember, the potassium lives where? Mostly inside the cells, and it just lives a little bit outside the cells. If you can take, though, the potassium that's outside your cells, you can actually force more of it into the cells themselves. So if you have hyperkalemia and you do something that makes the cells take up the potassium, then your body doesn't have the effects of the hyperkalemia. All that potassium is still there. It's still in your body, but if it's bound up inside the cell, then it can't go out and hurt you. It doesn't do the bad stuff anymore. So sticking it inside the cell is a good thing. You're hiding it. You're moving it other places. There they go. Those are good looking little things. One of the most common ways of doing that is insulin. If you remember from the hyperglycemia stuff and the diabetes stuff that we've talked about on this program before, insulin causes potassium to move into your cells. It doesn't get rid of insulin, it doesn't get rid of potassium, but it causes it to move into the cells themselves. The other thing that insulin does is make glucose go into your cells. And so your blood glucose drops when you give somebody insulin. So usually we have to administer D50 with this. Usually give about 10 units of regular insulin. You give it IV, you give them an amp of D50 with it, and their potassium falls. And that happens within about a half an hour or so. And that's one of the more effective treatments for hiding the potassium inside your cells, is forcing them to take it up with insulin. It's a good way of doing it. The other thing that does it, and is probably more for most of us working in the pre-hospital field, is albuterol. Regular old albuterol, a beta agonist. You can use, salbuterol or any of those things. A beta agonist basically causes your cells to take up potassium, and that dose of 10 units of insulin gets rid of about 1 millimole per liter of potassium. So your potassium goes down by 1. An albuterol neb or 2 probably takes it down by another 1. So you can hide these things in your cells, each one working kind of independently of the other one. How much albuterol should you give for this person? Well, you could just kind of put it on and give it to them. It's probably not going to hurt anything if they just get basically a continuous neb, but at least 1 2.5 milligram nebulization, if not 2, if you're thinking it's hyperkalemia. And again, what's the downside? Well, the downside would only be, I suppose, if they were severely hypokalemic and you just didn't realize that for some reason. And again, albuterol works in about 30 minutes or so. Which is about the time the potassium wears off. So it sort of works perfectly. You give the time the calcium wears off. So you give the calcium, which sort of temporizes things for about 30 minutes. And at that point, you've given the albuterol, you've given the insulin, and maybe not the insulin for if you're out in the field, but you may be transporting the person. As the calcium wears off, the other stuff comes in and starts working. And so here's, again, an example of treatment. This is a person that probably should be paced if they're in the field. They might even think about getting CPR because their heart rate's like 30 or something like that. They gave him calcium and they gave him insulin and they gave him some IV fluid, and he goes back to a normal beats. Cool. Here's the same thing, potassium 8.2, wide complex, not so bradycardic, but certainly wide. Newest potassium level, they gave him calcium, insulin, and dextrose. They gave him an albuterol neb and some IV fluid, and he goes back to normal, 30 minutes later, something like that. You'll see folks sometimes give sodium bicarbonate for this. The bicarbonate is really kind of only there for if they're acidotic. If you are acidotic, that causes potassium to leach out of your cells, and so if you try to reverse that acidosis, you can push it back in. It's not a real effective treatment if they're not acidotic, though. We give it because it's on ambulances often, and folks say, "Oh yeah, just give it to them and see if it works." But the bicarb itself is not all that effective in doing it if they're not acidotic. It does help to get rid of it a little bit, but it's sort of, the other stuff is better. But any port in a storm, if what you've got is what you've got is Ventolin or albuterol and sodium bicarb, then it's probably okay to do it as again, that's what's available to us, and it may help a little bit. At this point, we've done the thing to stabilize the cardiac membrane, number one. We've done the BVM thing. We've hidden the potassium someplace else in the body. At some point, you're going to have to get rid of the potassium. And this is not something that we are probably going to do in the field very much, but if you're doing interfacility transports, you may see people getting this. 3 ways to get rid of it. One is you can pee it out. The second way is that you can poo it out. And the last way is that you can pull it out. And pull it out means dialysis for the most part. Pee it out, generally, if you give somebody a dose of Lasix, like 40 of Lasix, which is why you may see this given for some of these guys, you tend to excrete potassium with it. Folks that are on Lasix chronically have problems maintaining their potassium sometimes. So you get rid of it eventually, assuming that you have relatively functional kidneys. It's not going to work right away. It's going to take 40 minutes, an hour before you really even start seeing the patient pee more. But eventually, it will get rid of the stuff. Dialysis is about the fastest way. Just suck that stuff on out of there and leave it in a vat of wastewater someplace if they're end-stage renal disease or really hard off on their kidneys. The other thing you'll see folks get, and if the nurse at the transferring facility is smart, the patient will have gotten a dose of K-exolate immediately prior to transport. And I say smart because then she doesn't have to deal with the consequence of giving the K-exolate. K-exolate is a potassium binding solution. You give this orally, it sits in your gut and it soaks up potassium and you don't absorb it, and so you poop it out. It basically is like a potassium sponge that goes in your stomach, swirls around your gut for a while, soaks up potassium, and then you poo out the sponge. That's the way potassium works. You usually give it with a laxative because it will bind you up like nobody's business. Folks, if you want a really effective treatment for diarrhea, if you get a dose of K-exolate, that will often do it. So we usually give this with laxatives. It again does probably work. It's got a lot of side effects with it. We don't really like giving it much anymore, and it can cause some intestinal necrosis, but you may see somebody get it, and that's why. The idea is that they are binding up the potassium and pooing it out. It's not going to help in the short term, though. There's no reason that this person emergently needs K-exolate. If they needed K-exolate, they probably should have gotten all the other stuff that goes along with it. Otherwise, it's not an emergency, and you can tell a nurse, hey, do they really have to have this right now? If not, why don't we just hold off on it? All right, let's sum up on potassium here. The level of potassium doesn't matter as much as the EKG does. The real determinant, like, is this person super, super, super sick, is what their EKG is doing. And that note can change relatively quickly. So these people need to be on cardiac monitors. And even a person who has a potassium of 6.1 could go into arrest kind of at any point. So you got to watch real closely. The big determinant for how sick these people are is really what their EKG is doing. If you have somebody that you don't know the potassium level, but they are in a weird, slow, or wide complex EKG rhythm, you should think there's a good chance this might be hyperkalemia, and look for any other evidence to support that, or get a level if you happen to be working at a hospital or on a critical care transport. If you think the person has hyperkalemia, you should think I should give them some calcium. And you give as much of that as it takes to narrow their QRS. That's the determinant in terms of how much calcium they have actually, when have they gotten sufficient amount of calcium. It's when their QRS gets narrow. And then after you've given the calcium, you should think, I should give this person some albuterol if I have the ability, some insulin and glucose, and maybe some bicarb. And the idea, again, is to hide the potassium in the cells so that your body doesn't know it's there and doesn't react in the way that it does, which is, for hyperkalemia folks, often dying. So it's a big issue. It's not most people. It's relatively rare. Most of the cardiac arrests you see are not going to be hyperkalemia, But you kind of got to think if they have a wide complex rhythm and it's really like bradycardic, you might think to yourself, I wonder if this person actually has uh, hyperkalemia. I wonder if I should give them some calcium. And if you don't have calcium in your protocol, you probably should think about getting some, because it's about the only thing that's going to save these folks if they do have it. You can give them all the insulin in the world, you can give them all the albuterol. If they're in cardiac arrest, it's probably not going to make much difference. You need to give them calcium. You can give them all the epi you want, not going to make any difference if their potassium is 7 and change, and that's what's doing it. But you give them the calcium, and all of a sudden they get a lot better, a lot. So that's my spiel on hyperkalemia. Hopefully it was somewhat interesting.